The first snow of the season came early that year, riding in on a wind that stripped the last leaves from the cottonwoods in a single afternoon, and it found the hole in Edith Marlowe's roof the way trouble always finds the thing you have been meaning to fix. She stood in her kitchen at first light with a bucket already a third full and watched the drip come off the ceiling beam in its slow, patient rhythm, and she did the arithmetic a widow does. Wood enough for 2 months. Flour for 3 if she stretched it. A roof that would not survive a real storm, and no man in that house to climb up and see to it, not for 2 years now, not since the fever took Thomas in a week that had started ordinary and ended with her alone on 40 acres with a milk cow, a garden gone to seed, and a silence that had its own weight. Edith Marlowe was 34 years old and she had learned the particular skill of not looking too long at the whole of a problem. You looked at the piece in front of you. You dealt with that piece. So she emptied the bucket, set it back under the drip, and put on her coat to walk the 1.5 miles into town, because the piece in front of her was a roof, and somewhere in that town there had to be a man who could mend one. The man she found was not the one she went looking for. He was sitting on the bench outside the livery with a canvas pack at his feet and his hands loose between his knees, and he had the stillness of a man who has run out of places he is expected to be. 38, maybe 40. Broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who had done real work his whole life, with a face that had weathered past handsome into something quieter. She had seen him around town twice that week, taking day labor where it came, sleeping she didn't know where, and she had heard the talk at the general store the way a woman hears everything in a small town whether she wants to or not. Name of John Garrett. Came in on the freight road from the north. Kept to himself. Worked hard and said little and moved on, was the general expectation, the way such men did before the snow closed the passes. The blacksmith had no time until spring. The Hendricks boys wanted more than she had. She stood on the boardwalk with the cold coming up through her boots and looked across the street at the stranger on the bench, and she took the measure of him the way her mother had taught her to take the measure of anything, which was slowly, and by the hands and the eyes rather than the mouth. His hands were a carpenter's hands. His eyes, when they lifted and met hers across the street, did not slide away and did not press. They simply held, steady, the eyes of a man with nothing to prove and nothing to hide, which in her experience were nearly the rarest kind. She crossed the street before she had finished deciding to. He stood when she got close, which told her something, and he waited, which told her more. She came straight to it, because dressing a thing up had never once made it easier to say. She had a roof with a hole in it and a hard winter coming and no money to speak of, but she had a woodshed a man could sleep in warm and dry, and she had a garden's worth of preserves and a cellar that would hold. Fix the roof and I'll feed you till spring, she said. 3 meals a day, cooked proper. The shed has a stove in it. Come spring, you go wherever you were going. John Garrett looked at her for a long moment. Behind his eyes something moved that she could not read, some private ledger being consulted, some old sum being figured. The wind came down the street between them, carrying the first loose flakes of the next snow, and neither of them looked away from the other. I'd want to see the roof first, he said. No sense promising what I can't deliver. It was the most honest answer a man had given her in 2 years. She nodded once. Then come see it, she said, and turned back up the road toward home, and after a moment she heard his boots on the frozen ground behind her, keeping pace, asking nothing. The walk out to the Marlowe place took the better part of an hour, and they did it mostly in silence, which suited them both. She learned 3 things about him on that road without asking a single question. He walked on the outside of her, between her and the wind, and did it without ceremony, as if his feet had simply decided the matter on their own. He carried his pack like it weighed nothing, which meant it held nothing, which meant everything he owned in the world was on his back and it was not much. And when a wagon came up behind them and rattled past, he lifted 2 fingers to the driver in the way of countrymen everywhere, and the driver looked at him and then at her and did not wave back, and John Garrett registered that and said nothing about it, and neither did she. The talk would start before supper. She had known that when she crossed the street. The house came into view around the last bend, and she watched him look at it. He did not look at it the way a drifter looks at shelter. He looked at it the way a builder looks at a building, his eyes going up the chimney line, along the porch posts, across the swayback ridge of the roof, cataloging, measuring, adding things to a list she could not see. He stopped at the gate and stood there a moment. "Whoever built this knew what he was doing," he said. "My husband's father. 1871. The roof's not original. Thomas replaced it the year we married. He didn't know what he was doing." She said it plainly, without disloyalty in it, just the truth. He knew cattle. The roof was a thing he did because it needed doing. Something that was almost a smile moved at the corner of John Garrett's mouth and was gone. "Most of the work in the world gets done that way," he said, and went up the ladder she kept against the barn without being told where it was, as if he had already found it with his eyes on the walk-in. He was on the roof for the better part of 30 minutes. She went inside and stirred the fire up and put coffee on, not because she had decided anything, but because it was cold and there were rules about cold and coffee that predated her and would outlast her. Through the window she could hear him moving up there, slow and deliberate, the occasional press of a boot testing a board, twice the sound of a shingle being pried and set back. When he came down, he came to the kitchen door, not the front, and he took his hat off before he knocked on the frame of the open door, and she added those two things to the ledger she was keeping on him. "It's worse than a hole," he said. "There was no salesmanship in it and no softening. You've got rot in the decking on the north slope, maybe 8 feet of it, where the water's been getting in longer than you knew. The hole is just where it finally showed itself. I can patch the hole in a day and it'll leak again by February. Or I can open up the north slope, replace the decking, and reshingle it proper, and it'll outlast both of us." He turned his hat once in his hands. "The second way needs lumber. Lumber needs money. I know that wasn't the bargain." Edith stood at the stove with the coffee behind her and looked at him. 2 years of managing alone had taught her exactly how rare it was for a man to hand a woman the whole truth of a thing and let her decide what to do with it. Most of them gave her the version that suited them and waited for her to be grateful. "There's a stand of pine on the back 40, she said. "Thomas felled 6 trees the autumn before he died. They've been down and drying 2 years. Can you mill them?" John Garrett's eyebrows went up a 1/4 inch, which she would learn was the whole of his astonishment. "By hand, with a pit saw or a good rip saw, yes. It'd add 2 weeks. Then it adds 2 weeks. She took down a second cup and filled it and set it on the table, which was its own kind of contract. "Sit down, Mr. Garrett. If you're going to be here till spring, you'd best know how I take my coffee, and I'd best know how you take yours." He looked at the cup on the table. Then he sat, and the chair held him, and outside the snow began to come down in earnest, sealing the bargain neither of them had quite finished making. The shed was better than he expected, and he told her so, which she appreciated more than a thank you. It had been Thomas's workshop once, 16 feet by 12, with a small iron stove in the corner, a workbench along one wall, and a cot that had served for the lambing seasons when a man needed to sleep close to the barn. She brought out 2 quilts and a lamp, and she watched him take stock of the place the way he took stock of everything, without hurry, and she saw him stop at the workbench. Thomas's tools were still on the pegboard above it. A plane, 2 saws, a brace and a set of bits, chisels and a canvas roll gone stiff with 2 years of disuse. A film of dust and shallow rust over all of it, the way steel goes when the hands that kept it are gone. John Garrett stood in front of that pegboard a long moment, and he did not touch anything. "I'll keep to my own tools," he said finally. "You'll use his," Edith said, and her voice came out steadier than the sentence deserved. "Rust is a worse ending for a tool than work is." He'd have said the same. He looked at her, and there passed between them one of those brief, weightless moments in which 2 strangers understand each other completely and agree never to mention it. He nodded once. That evening, through the kitchen window, she saw the lamp burning in the shed until late, and in the morning every tool on that pegboard had been cleaned and oiled and hung back precisely where it had been, the rust gone, the edges brought back. He never said he had done it. She never said she had noticed. That was the manner of dealings between them, established in the first 24 hours and never renegotiated. He started on the roof the second morning, and the first thing the town learned about John Garrett was that he did not work like a man earning his keep. He worked like a man being watched by God. He was on the north slope at first light and he came down when the light failed, and in between there was the steady rhythm of the pry bar and the hammer, the rotten decking coming off in gray, crumbling sections that he dropped and stacked and later split for kindling because he was not a man who wasted anything, including ruin. By the end of the third day the north slope was open to the sky and covered over each night with canvas he lashed down against the wind, and the pile of sound lumber from the back 40 had begun its slow transformation under the rip saw, 2 hours every evening, the long, patient strokes carrying across the yard in the cold air like the breathing of the farm itself. Edith kept her end of the bargain the way she kept everything, thoroughly and without display. Breakfast was on the table when the light came. Dinner went out to him at noon, and she took it out herself rather than ringing a bell, because a bell was for hired men and she had not yet decided what he was, only what he wasn't. Supper was at 6, in the kitchen, at the table, because she had tried on the first night to hand him a plate at the door of the shed and he had taken it and thanked her, and she had gone back inside and sat down alone at a table set for one, and the silence of the house had come down on her like weather, and she had gotten up, walked back out through the cold, and said, "This is foolishness. The food's hot and the kitchen's warm. You'll eat at the table." So he ate at the table. And the meals were the education of him, though she did not know at first that was what they were. He ate like a man who had spent years eating food that was fuel and nothing more, boarding house food, cooked tent food, food made by people who would never see his face again. The first time she set down a chicken and dumplings with a gravy she had built the slow way, he went still over the plate for a moment before he picked up his fork, and she pretended not to see it. The first time she made bread pudding with the last of the summer's preserves folded through it, he ate it in the manner of a man conducting himself carefully in church. "Where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked her once. "My mother. She cooked for a bunkhouse of 12 before she married." He nodded slowly. "It's a thing you can taste," he said, "when food's made by somebody who means it," and then he looked faintly surprised at himself, as if the sentence had gotten out before he approved it, and he went back to his plate, and Edith turned to the stove so he would not see her face doing what it was doing. The talk reached her on a Thursday, 10 days in, carried out to the farm by Ada Pruitt in a buggy, wrapped in a basket of dried apples the way such deliveries are always wrapped in something else. Ada was the minister's wife, a small, quick woman with kind intentions and a mouth that ran ahead of them, and she sat in Edith's kitchen with her gloves folded in her lap and got through the apples and the weather and the state of the church roof, which Edith noted was suddenly of great interest, before she arrived at the true cargo. People were talking. Ada said it gently, the way you report rain, as if it were nobody's doing. A woman alone, a strange man living on the place, no kin in the house, no ring on anyone's finger. Mrs. Cutts at the general store had used the word arrangement, and had used it with a particular lean on it. Nobody doubted Edith's character, Ada hurried to say, in the way people say a thing precisely because it has been doubted aloud in their hearing. It was only how it looked. It was only what people might think. Edith poured more coffee and let the silence sit long enough that Ada shifted in her chair. Through the window behind the minister's wife, John Garrett was visible on the north slope, laying new decking board by board, his breath standing in the cold air, working in that steady, consuming way of his, as unaware of the conversation as the roof itself. "He sleeps in the shed," Edith said finally. "He eats at my table because it's warmer than the yard. He is mending the roof over my head in exchange for food, because I had no money to pay a man, and no man in this town would take the work for what I had. When it's done, he'll go." She set the pot down. "That's the whole of the arrangement, Ada. You may carry it back in the same basket the apples came in." Ada had the grace to flush. But at the door, drawing on her gloves, she paused, and for a moment the messenger fell away and the woman underneath looked out. "For what it's worth," she said quietly, "Homer Pruitt has preached 40 years on the subject of judging not, and I've watched this town not listen for all 40. You feed that man well, Edith. He looks like nobody's done it in a long while." And she went down the steps and clucked the horse into motion and was gone, leaving Edith standing in her doorway holding two truths at once, which was that the town would talk all winter, and that she had stopped caring somewhere around the second snowfall. She learned him slowly, in the way you learn anything real, sideways and by accident. He did not volunteer his history, and she did not mind for it, but a life leaves marks, and she could read. He knew engines and he knew horses, which placed him wide. He read in the evenings, whatever was in the shed, and when she left a volume of Dickens on the workbench with no comment, it came back 2 weeks later with no comment, and another took its place. He flinched, very slightly, at the slam of a door, not at loud sounds generally, only that one, and she filed it away and began closing doors softly, and if he noticed the change he kept it to himself. And once, only once in those early weeks, the past put its head up. She asked him at supper, easy and unloaded, whether he had family anywhere, and John Garrett's fork stopped over his plate for a moment. "A brother," he said. "Montana. We don't write. Falling out." He was quiet long enough that she thought the question would die there. "There was a farm," he said at last. "Our father's. There was a debt, and there was a bad year, and there were two brothers who each thought the other one lost it." He turned his fork over once, looked at it. "I was the one who signed the paper. So I suppose he's right and I'm wrong, and it's taken me 11 years of walking to get comfortable saying so." He ate the bite. That was the end of it. But she understood something then that reordered everything she had observed, which was that the roof was not work to him. A man who had lost a farm, mending a farm. Every sound board he laid on her house was a letter to Montana that would never be sent. That night she stood at the window in the dark and looked at the lamp burning out in the shed and thought about the ways people fix what they can reach, because they cannot fix what they can't. The north slope was closed in by the middle of December, shingled tight and true, the lines of it so straight that men passing on the road slowed their wagons to look, because good work announces itself in a country where everyone knows what bad work costs. He did not stop there. She had hired a roof mended and found herself watching a farm come back to itself one small repair at a time, none of them announced, none of them in the bargain. The sagging gate stopped sagging. The barn door stopped dragging its complaint across the frozen ground. The porch rail steadied under a hand. The pump handle stopped shrieking. Each morning some small brokenness she had learned to live with was simply gone, and it was like watching a man go through a house closing wounds. The bargain was the roof, she said to him once, watching him reset the cellar door on new hinges. The bargain was till spring, he said, not looking up. Roof didn't take till spring. She let it stand, because arguing a man out of usefulness was foolishness, and because the truth underneath it, which they both could see and neither would name, was that he was a man built for tending things, and he had been 11 years without a single thing to tend. The storm came in the third week of December, and it came the way the big ones do, with a day of strange warmth ahead of it, the snow going soft and the air turning still and yellow-gray, and John Garrett stood in the yard at noon reading the sky like print. He spent that afternoon hauling wood into the lean-to until it was stacked to the beams, running a guide rope from the house to the barn and another to the shed, and driving the cow and the horse in early with a grain feed to settle them. Edith watched the preparations and made her own, cooking ahead, filling every pot and kettle with water, setting lamps and oil where hands could find them in the dark. It hit at nightfall and it did not let up for 2 days. The wind came down off the high country like something with a grudge in it, and the snow went sideways, and the world past the window glass simply ceased. The roof, the new north slope taking the brunt of the load, held without a whisper, and Edith lay in her bed the first night listening to a silence overhead where 2 years of leaks and worry had lived, and found the quiet almost strange, the way an old pain is strange when it finally stops. It was the second night that the knock came, and it was not at the door. It was the cow. He came through the storm on the guide rope to tell her, snow packed into every seam of him, and his face said it before he did. The cow had come to her time early, the calf was turned wrong, and it was going to be a long night, and he had done this before but never with 2 hands only. Edith was dressed and booted before he finished the sentence. The barn that night was a small yellow world of lantern light hung inside the roar of the storm, and what happened in it took 4 hours and everything both of them had. He worked with his coat off and his sleeve rolled to the shoulder, patient and low-voiced, talking to the laboring animal in a steady murmur that was less words than weather, and Edith held the lantern and hauled when he said haul and braced when he said brace, and somewhere in the middle of it, both of them straining on the same rope with the wind screaming at the walls, all the careful distance they had kept for 6 weeks simply stopped existing, because there is no polite distance between two people saving a life. The calf came a little before 3 in the morning, limp and steaming in the lantern light, and did not breathe, and John Garrett cleared its mouth and rubbed its chest with a twist of straw with a terrible gentle violence, and said, under his breath, not to Edith and not to God exactly, not tonight. Not this one too. And the calf coughed, and shuddered, and breathed. They sat afterward against the stall partition in the straw, shoulder to shoulder because that was simply where the sitting was, too spent to mind it, watching the cow tongue the wobbling calf into its legs. Edith's hair had come down. His arm was bloody to the elbow. The storm went on overhead, and the roof held, and neither of them said anything for a long while, and the silence was the fullest either had known in years. Not this one too, she said finally, quietly, giving his own words back to him. He looked at the lantern flame for a moment. That's a story for a different night, he said. But he said night like a door left unlocked, and she nodded, and they sat until the calf stood. The storm blew itself out on the 3rd morning, and the world it left behind was blinding white and utterly still, the fences reduced to a suggestion, the shed a soft white hill with a stovepipe, the whole country lying under 3 feet of snow like something put away in a drawer. They dug out slowly, the two of them, and the town dug out too, and it was a week before the road was anything a buggy could manage, which meant it was Christmas before the different night arrived, and it arrived the way such nights do, without being planned. She had killed one of the hens for the day, and there was a pie made from the dried apples Ada Pruitt's gossip had ridden in on, which Edith considered a fair exchange, and she had set the table with the good cloth because a day is only as much of an occasion as somebody makes it. He came in at dusk with snow on his shoulders and a small object in his hand, and he set it beside her plate with the particular awkwardness of a man who has not given anyone anything in a long time. It was a wooden box, small enough to sit in her palm, dovetailed at the corners, sanded and oiled until the grain moved in the lamplight like water, and the lid slid on a track so true it sighed. He had made it in the evenings, from a piece of the old decking, from the sound heart of a rotten board, and when she understood that he had taken the ruin of her roof and made something fine from the part of it that was still good, she had to set it down and see to the stove for a moment. "I've nothing for you," she said. He looked at the table, the hen, the pie, the good cloth, the warm room, the whole of it. "You're mistaken," he said. It was after the meal, with the dishes done and the lamp turned low and the cold pressing its face against the windows, that he told her. He told it sitting at the table with his hands around a cup of coffee gone cold, in a level voice, the way a man tells a thing he has arranged carefully in his own mind so that it can be carried. There had been a wife. Her name was Nora, and there had been a boy, named for the brother in Montana back when there was still warmth between them, and there had been the farm, and for 6 years John Garrett had been the richest man he knew by every measure that counted. Then had come the diphtheria winter, the one that emptied half the schoolhouses in that county, and it had taken the boy in 4 days, and Nora had followed inside of a year, and the doctor called it her heart and John Garrett called it accurate. The debt had been real and the bad year had been real, but the truth he had walked 11 years to say out loud was that after the two of them went into the ground, he had stopped fighting for the farm because he could not see what the farm was for. His brother had fought for it. His brother had lost. His brother had needed somebody to blame, and John had signed the paper and taken the blame with him when he went, because it was lighter to carry than the other thing. "Not this one too," Edith said softly, when he was done. "I didn't know it was still in me," he said. "It came out on its own." He turned the cup slowly on the table. 11 years, I've kept moving. You put a thing behind you and you keep it behind you by never standing still. Then a woman crosses a street and offers me a roof and 3 plates a day. He looked up at her, and for the first time since the platform of his own life, he let her see all the way in. I know what the town says. I want you to know what's true. I didn't stay for the food, Edith. I stayed because for the first time in 11 years, staying hurt less than going. The lamp fluttered. Outside, the snow lay silent over everything, and the new roof held the warmth in the house like cupped hands. Thomas has been gone 2 years, she said at last. I've been keeping house for a grief. Cooking for it. Wintering with it. She met his eyes and did not look away. These last weeks are the first time the food's been for somebody living. I don't know yet what that means. But I know I don't want it to stop. He nodded slowly. Neither of them reached across the table. It was too soon for that, and they were both people who did things in their proper order. But something had been said that could not be unsaid, and both of them slept that night the way you sleep when a weight has been set down. January settled in long and white, and the days found a rhythm that neither of them examined too closely for fear of startling it. He built her a proper kitchen shelf where she had been stacking pans on a chair for 2 years. She let out the shoulders of one of Thomas's wool coats without being asked, because John's own had worn through at the seams, and when he understood whose coat it was he stood holding it a moment, and she said, "Rust is a worse ending for a coat than work is," and he put it on, and that was the whole conversation. Mornings, there were 2 cups on the counter. Evenings, there was reading aloud by the stove, because she had discovered he liked being read to, this large quiet man, liked it the way a person likes a thing they lost young, and she had a good voice for it and used it, and outside the snow came and went across the fields like the turning of enormous pages. The trouble came up the lane on the last Friday of the month, in a cutter with a matched team, both of them too fine for the road they were on. Edith knew the man before he was halfway to the porch, and her spine changed, and John, who was splitting stove wood by the shed, read the spine before he ever looked at the visitor. Harlan Marlowe. Thomas's cousin, out of the county seat, a man in a town coat with a lawyer's satchel and the well-fed patience of somebody who had been waiting a long time for a thing to ripen. He was pleasant on the porch, which was the worst of it. He was sorry to come unannounced. He was sorrier still about the business that brought him, and here he opened the satchel, and there it was. A note against the farm, $800, signed by Thomas Marlowe in the spring before the fever, money borrowed against a cattle purchase that the fever had turned to nothing. Harlan had bought up the paper from the bank that autumn, quietly, the way you do a thing you intend to use. He had let it sit, he said, out of family feeling, out of respect for her mourning. But the note had a date on it, and the date was the 1st of April, and family feeling, he explained, in the voice of a man deeply burdened by his own reasonableness, could not be expected to carry a debt forever. 800 by April, or the farm passed to him. He had heard, he added, glancing at the shed, at the woodpile, at the man standing by it with the axe hanging easy in one hand, that she had taken in help. Perhaps her hired man could advise her. And there was a lien on the words hired man, the same lien Mrs. Cutts had used on arrangement, and it was meant to reach the shed, and it did. Edith stood very still on her own porch. 2 years of managing alone had taught her the cost of everything, and she did the arithmetic in front of him without letting her face do any of it. The cow, the horse, the seed money, everything sellable on the place came to maybe 300, and it came to 300 only if she sold the spring out from under herself, which was the same as selling the farm slowly instead of quickly. Harlan knew that arithmetic too. He had done it before he ever bought the paper. That was what the paper was for. "You'll have your answer by April 1st, she said, and her voice was level, and she did not invite him in, and Harlan Marlowe smiled the smile of a man who mistakes composure for defeat, and got back in his cutter, and drove his fine team back down the lane. The silence after him was a different silence than the house had known all winter. She stood on the porch with the cold coming through her shawl, and she heard John set the axe into the block, and heard his boots cross the yard, and he came and stood at the bottom of the steps looking up at her, and it was the platform in the town street all over again, except she had not known that story and could not have said why the moment felt like standing on ground deciding whether to hold. "How much?" he said. That's not yours to carry. How much, Edith? 800. By April. She said it flatly, and then, because the whole truth was owed between them by now, I can raise 3. Selling what I can't spare. John Garrett looked at the fields lying white to the tree-line, and something in his face had gone very still and very far away, 11 years away, to another farm and another paper and another spring. When his eyes came back to her they had a thing in them she had not seen before, and it took her a moment to name it, because it looked so unlike him. It was anger. Banked and old and finally, after 11 years, pointed somewhere useful. No, he said quietly. Not this one too. What followed was a thing the town talked about for years afterward, though at the time it did not look like anything worth talking about. It looked like work. John Garrett came in from the yard that evening and sat at the table and laid it out the way he laid out a roof, whole, honest, worst first. 800 was not a sum a man earned in 9 weeks of winter day labor, not in that county, not in any county he had walked through in 11 years. But he had been in that town long enough now for his work to have been seen, and good work announces itself, and there was a thing he could do that no one within 40 miles did better, and he had been doing it in the evenings all winter without thinking of it as money. He went to the shed and came back and set the proof of it on the table between them, a second box, dovetailed and true, the grain swimming in the lamplight, and beside it a small plane he had made himself years ago with a body of applewood worn to amber by his own hand. Furniture, he said. Cabinets, chests, chairs. The county seat has money and no cabinetmaker since old Brant died, I asked. The hotel there wants a front desk built and the bank wants shelving and there's a doctor's wife who has been waiting 2 years for somebody who can make a proper dish cupboard. He turned the little box once with one finger. I can't raise 800. I can raise a fair piece of it, if I work like 2 men, and I've been 2 men before. It's the sitting still I never learned. The work I know. And I can raise the rest of the piece, Edith said slowly, the arithmetic already running, but running forward now instead of down. The cellar was full and her hands were good and the same county seat that had money for furniture had money for what came out of her kitchen, and every boarding house and hotel dining room in it was serving food made by people who did not mean it. Bread. Pies. Preserves from a garden the whole town knew. She looked at the man across the table and felt the strangest sensation of the whole strange winter, which was that the debt, the cutter in the lane, the smiling cousin with his satchel, all of it had somehow assembled itself into the first future she had been able to see clearly in 2 years. Not this one too, she said, and put out her hand across the table, and he took it, and that was the second contract between them, and like the first one it was worth more than paper. The weeks that followed had a ferocity in them that neither would have called joy, though it was Joy's working cousin. He was in the shed before light and the lamp burned long after dark, and the sound of the saw and the plane became the sound of the farm itself, and twice a week the borrowed wagon went to the county seat loaded, his work riding beside her baking, the smell of fresh bread and fresh shavings mixing in the cold air, which was, she thought once, very nearly the smell of the 2 of them. The hotel got its front desk, quarter-sawn oak with a face like still water, and the manager stood in front of it with his thumbs in his vest and asked who else Garrett was building for, in the tone of a man who intends to have been first. The doctor's wife got her cupboard and cried at it, actually cried, and told 4 other wives before supper. The orders came, and kept coming, and the ledger Edith kept in the kitchen drawer began its slow climb, $30, then 90, then 240. And the town, watching all of it, quietly changed its arithmetic too. It is a hard thing for a town to keep a scandal alive when the scandal keeps its lamps burning past midnight and its account square and its pew filled on Sunday, the 2 of them arriving in the wagon and sitting a proper foot apart and fooling no one. Mrs. Cutt stopped leaning on the word arrangement, mostly because nobody was buying it anymore. And Ada Pruitt, delivering eggs one gray afternoon and finding Edith flour dusted to the elbows with 6 pies cooling and an order book beside them, stood in the kitchen doorway and took the whole scene in and said, with great satisfaction, well. Harlan Marlowe always was a man for buying paper. Somebody ought to tell him what it's worth out here. But paper was patient, and April was coming, and by the middle of March the ledger stood at $510, honest and hard won and not enough, and they both knew a last hard thing would have to be done, and only one of them knew yet what it was. The hard thing Edith knew about was the horse. She had done the sums a dozen ways in the kitchen ledger and they always ended the same, 290 short with 3 weeks to run, and the only figures on the place worth that kind of money on short notice were standing in the barn eating hay. She decided it on a Tuesday, alone, the way she had decided everything for 2 years, and she said it at supper the way you say a thing you have already argued yourself through. The horse would bring 160 from the Hendricks outfit, the cow maybe 80 with the calf. It gutted the spring, but a gutted spring on her own land was better than a whole spring on Harlan Marlowe's. No, John said. It's not yours to refuse. The cow stays and the horse stays. He set his fork down, and she saw that his hand was not entirely steady, which in him was the equivalent of another man shouting. You sell the spring, you're selling the farm slow, you said it yourself the day he came. There's another way, and I've been circling it for a week, and I'd rather have gone back up on that roof in the storm than do it. He looked at the table. The hotel man asked me for a dining room. 12 chairs, 2 tables, a sideboard. Work I haven't built yet. Him and the banker and the doctor's wife's circle, between them there's $300 of orders I could deliver by summer. He was quiet a moment. Tomorrow I ride in and ask them to pay ahead. On my word. On work that doesn't exist yet. Edith understood then what she was looking at, and she set her own fork down and gave it the silence it was owed. For 11 years this man had made himself into someone who asked the world for nothing, because a man who asks for nothing can never again sign a paper that ruins anyone, never again be blamed. Asking was the one country he had refused to walk through. And he was going to walk through it for her farm. They'll say yes, she said quietly. Your work's been saying yes for you all winter. That's not the part that's hard, he said, and he took his plate to the basin, and that was the end of the talking, because some things a man has to carry across the yard by himself. He rode Thomas's horse to the county seat on the first clear morning, in Thomas's let-out coat, and Edith spent the day baking because her hands needed occupying, and he came back at dusk with the money in a bank envelope buttoned inside the coat. $310. The hotel manager had not even let him finish the asking, had waved it off midway and called for the cash box and said that in 30 years of paying for things ahead of getting them, this was the first time he'd felt he had the better end. The banker had made him sign a paper for it, being a banker, and John Garrett had signed his name to a debt for the first time in 11 years, and his hand had been steady on the pen, and he told Edith that at the kitchen table in a voice that had something in it like a man reporting he had swum a cold river and found he still knew how. What he did not tell her, that night, was the other thing. That in the morning, in the county seat, before any of the asking, he had stood at the post office window for the better part of 10 minutes with an envelope in his hand. That the envelope was addressed to Montana, to a name he had not written in 11 years, and that inside it was 1 page, and the page said what he had walked 1,000 miles to be able to say. That he was sorry. That the boy who was named for him had been the finest thing either of their lives produced. That he had found a place worth standing still for, and a woman worth standing still with, and that a man ought to know his brother was alive and where. He asked for nothing. He put no return address but the town's name. He had mailed it before he could reconsider, and it was gone north now, beyond recall, like everything a man finally says out loud. The ledger closed that week at $820. They counted it twice at the kitchen table, the lamp between them, April 3 days off, and neither of them said a word until the last bill was squared on the stack. Then Edith laughed, once, short and half disbelieving, and put her hand flat on the money, and John put his hand over hers. And the next morning, early, a rider came up the lane with the mail, and among it was a letter postmarked Montana, and it sat on the kitchen table all day, unopened, waiting for him to come down off the barn roof. He came down at noon and she said nothing, only stepped aside so the table was visible, and she watched him see it. He stood over the letter a long moment, the way he had stood over Thomas's tools that first evening, not touching. Then he picked it up, and turned it once, and went out to the porch with it, because some things a man has to open with the sky watching. Through the window she saw him read it. She saw him read it twice. She saw his shoulders, that had carried 11 years without complaint, let something down, and when he came back inside his eyes were wet and level at the same time, which she would not have thought possible before she saw it. The letter was short, and he read it to her, which was its own kind of vow. The brother's wife had written half of it, the brother the rest, in a hand that pressed too hard into the paper. There was a boy in Montana too, 7 years old, and there was a farm again, a rented one, worked back from nothing. The brother had spent 11 years telling himself the story where John lost the farm, and every year the story had gotten heavier instead of lighter, because that is what stories you know are false will do. Come in the summer, the letter said, at the end, after everything. Come see the boy. He has your walk. Bring her. Bring her, Edith said. I wrote to him about the farm. About the debt. John looked at the letter and then at her, plainly, the way he did everything. And I suppose about you. The words came out in that order and I didn't rearrange them. On the 1st of April, Harlan Marlowe's cutter came up a muddy lane, the fine team stepping unhappy in the thaw, and Harlan came onto the porch with his satchel and his patients, and Edith Marlowe met him at the door with the money counted into a bank envelope and a paper of her own, drawn up by the county seat lawyer, requiring his signature and the surrender of the note, witnessed. John Garrett stood at her shoulder, saying nothing, being visible, and the banker's clerk who had driven out for the occasion stood at the other, and Harlan looked at the arithmetic of the porch and understood that the thing he had waited 2 years to ripen had ripened for somebody else. He signed. He was pleasant about it, which was, again, the worst of him, and he went back down the steps, and at the bottom he paused and observed to the yard in general that Thomas would be glad the place stayed in family hands, and Edith said, level as a new floor, it hasn't yet. But it will. And Harlan Marlowe drove away with that riddle for company, and the mud took its opinion of his wheels the whole length of the lane. The snow went off the fields through the middle of the month, the creek running loud with it, the first green coming up through the gray like a rumor confirming itself. There was nothing left of the bargain. The roof was sound, the debt was paid, the winter was over, and by the terms struck on a boardwalk in November, John Garrett was free to go wherever he had been going. He did not go. He fixed the pasture fence instead, and turned the garden, and one evening in the last of April he came in and washed his hands longer than any hands needed washing, and Edith waited, because she knew the manner of him by now, and knew that the longer the washing, the larger the thing behind it. The bargain was till spring, he said finally, to the towel. Then he turned and looked at her, and put it as plainly as he had put the rot in the decking, the whole truth, worst first. Spring's here. I find I've no interest in the rest of the world. I'd like to stay, Edith. As your husband, if that's what you want. If it's not, I'll still fix whatever breaks here till the day I can't. She crossed the kitchen and took his hands, still damp, carpenter's hands, and she took the space that choosing for herself required, and the house waited, warm around them both. Fix the roof and I'll feed you till spring, she said. I've been thinking the terms need extending. Till the end, I was thinking. Meals included. I accept, he said, and his voice broke on the second word, and neither of them minded. They married in June, with Ada Pruitt weeping in the second pew and Mrs. Cutts telling everyone she had seen it coming from the start. In August they took the train north, and on a rented porch in Montana two brothers stood looking at each other for a long moment, and then embraced the way men do when words have already been mailed. The nephew did have his walk. Edith watched them cross the field together, matched stride for stride, and understood she was watching the last board go down on a roof 11 years open to the weather.